Hello and welcome to the Love Your Library podcast. I'm Isaac Vavashi and today I'm joined by Dave Goulson, who is a Professor of Biology at the University of Sussex. Dave specialises in insect ecology and conservation, and his new book, Silent Earth, Averting the Insect Apocalypse, draws on the latest research to offer an accessible and motivating overview of the decline in our insect populations. I spoke with Dave about what led him to a career studying the wonderfully strange insect world, and what we can do to support our insects. The interview starts with Dave reading an extract from Silent Earth.
I've been fascinated by insects all my life. One of my earliest memories is of finding at the age of 5 or 6 some stripy yellow and black caterpillars feeding on weeds growing from the cracks in the tarmac at the edge of the school playground. I gathered them up, placed them among the crumbs in my empty lunchbox and took them home. With the help of my parents, I found more of the right type of leaves for them to feed on. And eventually, the caterpillars transformed into handsome magenta and black moths. European readers might recognize them as cinnabar moths. This seemed like magic to me and still does. I was hooked.
Dave, thank you for coming onto the podcast. Your new book, Silent Earth, Averting the Insect Apocalypse, is a really motivating account of the decline in our insect populations and the actions that we need to take towards a more sustainable future. The book opens, as you just read, with some of your first memories of insects, and we really get a sense of your love for these misunderstood creatures throughout the book. I wondered if you could start by telling us just a bit more about what you see in insects that really pulls you to them.
It's an odd one, actually. I don't really know why I've always been drawn to insects. But I mean, they are amazing. They are incredibly diverse. There are so many different ones, weird and wonderful ones. Some of them stunningly beautiful, others not quite so much. All of them interesting when you get to know them and find out about, the kind of odd life cycles and behaviors and so on that they do. I mean, where do you start? I try to give some examples in the book of some of the more unusual insects that no one's ever heard of. But aside from being fascinating, they're really important and much underappreciated. People don't realize that whether we like them or not, we need them. They pollinate our crops, they recycle all sorts of things from cow pats to dead bodies. They keep the soil healthy, they keep pests under control, you name it, they do it basically. And if we didn't have insects, the world would grind to a halt.
And you touch in the book as well about how we sort of have this idea that people don't like bugs because they're gross, and that's completely irrelevant, isn't it? I think that kind of really came across in the book as well. That this idea that looking at insects in this way of how pleasing they are to the eye or how much we like them, it doesn't really matter, and I think that was a really strong point. Why do you think it is that most people kind of don't have that same affinity?
I mean, I don't know, because I can't put myself in the shoes of someone who doesn't like insects. I really struggle with that. I guess partly it's that most people grow up in cities these days. Particularly in the UK, 80% of people live in an urban area. And we're always more frightened of things that we're unfamiliar with. So I think partly it's just lack of familiarity that people grow up. And sadly, the insects you tend to find in towns are perhaps not the most endearing, cockroaches and houseflies and biting mosquitoes and things like that. They're few people's favorite insects. But I honestly don't know. It rather mystifies me why even the names we give them, creepy crawlies and bugs and whatever, it doesn't sound great, does it? So we're starting off on the wrong footing, really. But anyway, my mission in life is to try and turn that around and persuade everyone to love them, or at least to respect them.
And was there a moment that clicked to you to say, this is something that I need to follow for my life, that needs to be my career path here, or was it just sort of always obvious to you?
I never really thought about it. It was, I guess it was just sort of felt inevitable. I mean, actually, when I was a kid, it never really occurred to me that anyone would pay me to chase around after insects. I kind of felt I would always be interested in insects, but it would have to be, I assumed it would have to be a hobby, I think. And even when I was in my teens, I didn't really appreciate, I remember having advice from a careers advisor And I told him what I was interested in, and the best he could do was suggest I should be a vet, which, didn't sound too bad, but wasn't really what I wanted to do. And so when I eventually worked out that I could do research on insects and actually make a living out of it, I thought that was brilliant, and it's been a real privilege ever since.
So you're talking throughout the book about the many ways that we actually do have a very close relationship with insects, maybe in ways that everyday people don't see. I wonder if you could sort of tell us a bit more about that.
Well, we depend on them more than we realize. I think most people have no real idea. Apart from, that's not quite true, actually. I think most people these days are aware that we need pollinators, and they probably misguidedly think that pollination is always done by honeybees, which is quite a long way from the truth. Pollination is actually done by thousands of different species. But people don't really appreciate all the other stuff that insects do for us. The importance. Dung beetles, for example, they're not the most glamorous creatures, but what they do is really vital. And I actually talk in the book about, there's this really interesting example which shows how important dung beetles are, which is that when we Europeans moved to Australia, we took cattle with us, but there aren't any dung beetles native to Australia that can cope with cowpats. They're too liquid, and they're used to Australian mammal poo like kangaroo poo, which is really hard and dry, and the poor things literally drown in a cowpat. And because there was nothing to get rid of the cowpats, the cowpats just dried rock hard and started to accumulate, so that the farmers' fields just became full of, there was no grass, there was just a sea of dried cowpats. And so they had to import the right kind of dung beetles, and it was incredibly successful. And now the cowpats all disappear within a few hours of being produced, and that releases the nutrients in the cowpats, and the grass grows, and the cows have something to eat, and everyone's happy. But in the rest of the world, we've always taken that service for granted. None of us really thinks about it. But that's just one example of important things that insects are quietly, busily doing that we just never notice.
A lot of the parts of the book, you're making these really interesting and exciting parts of insect life really accessible to people who, like me, are not experts in the field. And one of the things that you include are these sort of insect profile intervals throughout the book. And I just wondered whether you could tell me a bit about how you selected those insects. There must be millions of species. Was that a difficult process for you?
Yeah, there are literally millions of species of insect that we know of, and probably millions more that we haven't named. And so the reason I put those in at the beginning of every chapter was because actually I was aware, even before I started writing this book, that a lot of it has the potential of being quite dark and depressing. And I just wanted to lighten it up by reminding people how cool and interesting insects are. And just so every chapter starts with a short one-side description of a weird and wonderful insect. But there are so many to pick. Basically, I tried to pick ones that I didn't think many people would have heard of. Some of the better known insect examples I could have chosen people might already know, and I didn't really want that. So I wanted things that people would read and go, wow, that's really cool, and they'd want to tell people about the firefly or the emerald cockroach wasp, and so on and so on. They are really amazing creatures, and it's nice to just try and engage people by explaining just some of these weird things that insects do.
Yeah, and they definitely give you this really interesting view of how different and strange insects can be. But you said about how some of the book can be quite dark. And of course, it isn't necessarily so, because it's the future that looms over us if we don't take action to support our insect population. But you do something very interesting in chapter 16 with that, where you give us a view from the future, writing in the first person from the perspective of your son. And I wondered if you could tell us a bit about how you felt writing that and why you wanted to include that in the book.
It was uncomfortable, actually, trying to imagine. So basically, the chapter is written as if it was my son writing it when he's 80 years old. So he's 20 now, so 60 years in the future, in 2080, looking back on his life. And I imagine, what will happen unless we really pull our finger out and try and address these environmental problems that we face. And so I mean, actually, it's the first time I've ever really tried to write what's essentially fiction. And I debated whether to include it at all, but I think actually it kind of pulls together all the different issues that, it isn't just about biodiversity loss or just about climate change. There's this whole kind of perfect storm of problems we're creating with soil erosion and overfishing of the seas and all the different types of pollution we're creating and so on and so on. And people rarely try to kind of work out the combined effects of all of these things on our planet and on future generations of people. So yeah, it's not the most positive chapter, but it's meant to basically be a bit of a kick up the arse for people to say, look, basically your children and your grandchildren are going to probably have a tough time, at least a tougher time than my generation did, because basically we've exploited most of the planet's resources and wiped out loads of species and left them to pick up the pieces. That's the real danger. So I'm trying basically to avoid that chapter coming true by telling people how bad it might be. So I imagine a world where lots of people have starved to death because there aren't any pollinators. It's hard to grow crops with climate change. There's no fish left in the sea, and the soils are mostly eroded so that we can't grow crops, and so on and so on. Hopefully it never comes true, but time will tell, I guess.
Yeah, I thought it was really effective because you talk about the shifting baseline, that we forget how much more biodiverse the world was, our countryside was maybe 60 odd years ago, and that we kind of lose maybe some of the impact of what's been happening just from pure human fallibility and the tricks our minds play in perception and memory. I think it does a really good job of bringing us forwards and looking back so that we can see the woods from the trees, and sort of condensing what you're presenting in the book to the reality that we'll face.
I hope so. I mean, it is really interesting, actually, that we normalize the world that we experience. We think that's how it's always been and how it always should be, because most people aren't very keen on change. But actually, all the evidence we have is that biodiversity was massively greater, let's say, 100 years ago. Our grandparents and great-grandparents lived in a very profoundly different world. And our children, for example, my youngest son is 11. Now, the detailed butterfly data we have for the UK is from a scheme that started in 1976, which just happens to be when I was 11. And that monitoring data tells us that butterflies were pretty much twice as abundant when I was 11 as now when my son is 11. So he's growing up in a world where he thinks it's normal to see half the number of butterflies that I saw as a child. And, I guess the worry is that his children will grow up in a world where they never see any butterflies. And, that to me would be really sad.
And did you find it quite hard to write from your son's perspective?
Yeah, I mean, it's quite depressing, actually. But interesting. I mean, actually, the first thing I did when I wrote it was gave it to my son and said, are you happy with this? Because obviously I'm pretending to be him for a start. And he liked it. So I figured that I should probably include it in the book.
So what can our listeners do to support our insect populations?
So the good news is, and there is good news, is that it isn't too late for most insects. Most of them haven't gone extinct, and they can breed and recover their populations pretty quickly if we just give them some space, somewhere to live, stop spraying them with pesticides and so on. And also, what I really like about this is that it's people can get involved. It's hard to stop rainforest being chopped down in Brazil. It's really easy to do something about the insects that live in our gardens and parks and local areas, the road verge near your house or whatever. So one of the obvious things we can do is make our gardens more wildlife friendly. Don't use pesticides, don't mow the lawn too often, grow some wildflowers, maybe put up a bee hotel and dig a little pond, and all the small things, little things you can do at the weekend. And if everyone did that, there are 22 million gardens in the UK covering an area. It's about 400,000 hectares, which is a bigger area than all of our nature reserves. And if we could get the council on board so that the road verges were full of flowers and the roundabouts and the cemeteries and the parks had wildflower meadows, and, that would link up all the gardens. And that would make a really big difference. It wouldn't solve all of our problems, but it would be a start. And it would also help to engage people with thinking about, what they can do for nature. The thornier issue is how do we grow food in a way that supports nature? Because one of the biggest drivers of insect declines is basically intensive farming and the associated chemical use. But there are alternatives. There's organic farming, there's biodynamic farming, there are other interesting kind of developments, things called agroforestry and permaculture and so on. And most of us can find organic food in our local supermarket or can get it delivered in a box or whatever. And I think, so that's another thing we can do, think about what we buy. And if we all switched to eating locally produced seasonal fruit and veg, ideally organically produced fruit and veg, and ate less meat and wasted less food, and just the little things like that, it's all cumulative. If enough people did it, it'd make a real difference.
Yeah, and obviously, if our listeners are looking for a point to start, I would definitely recommend starting with Silent Earth. You really start from the kind of introduction to why we should care about insects, to a bit of natural history, and then going into the problems that we're facing today and what we can do to stop them. But are there other starting points that you can recommend out there to sort of educate ourselves a bit better?
Actually, so my YouTube channel is basically full of ideas for things people can do in terms of what flowers they can grow and how to make bee hotels and nest boxes for bumblebees and things like that. There's some really good ID books these days if you want to try and work out what insects you're seeing in your garden. There's a lovely book about called it's just a guide to the field guide to the bees of Britain and Ireland. If you're interested, there's about 270 species of bee flying around our country, and you can, if you're lucky, you might see upwards of 60 or 70 species in a garden if you keep your eyes peeled. So have a look, see what you can find. And I just encourage people actually to just go outside if they're lucky enough to have a green space near where they live. Even this late in the year, if you find some flowers, there's a lot of insects about. In fact, I'm just looking out the window now, and there are red admiral butterflies and bees and whatnot on the flowers. Just spend a bit of time and see what you can see, because there's this whole kind of tiny world that's all around us and lives right under our noses, and people hardly ever take the time to just kind of have a look at it and get down on their hands and knees and engage with nature. It's well worth doing if you've got a bit of time on your hands.
So we've got your new book, Silent Earth, that came out in August in the UK. But what's next for you? What are you looking at next?
So potentially excitingly, I've been in talks about making a documentary film essentially based on Silent Earth, and being involved in potentially presenting that, which would be really a bit of a departure for me, but be a really nice way of getting to a bigger audience. So time will tell whether it actually happens, but I'm quite excited at the prospect at the moment.
That sounds great. We'll have to keep our eye out for that. And where else can our listeners find you? Is there on social media, Twitter?
Yeah, aside from the YouTube, I'm on Twitter and Facebook and all the usual. I haven't managed Instagram yet, but I can't do everything.
Brilliant. No, thank you. And thank you for joining us.
Been a pleasure.